Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Jose Antonio, and we are here for another Speculative Legal Theory Network meeting. And for this meeting, we have two things that we would like to do. First, we're having a conversation with Swastee, who is presenting a little bit about relations between law and object-oriented ontology and how that impacts her work. And then at the last part, we are going to try to save a little time to discuss this year's Critical Legal Conference, which is themed speculation. So it's going to be an interesting opportunity for us to see how speculative theory is impacting legal theory and critical legal theory in particular. And especially we're going to discuss the streams that both I and Swastee have proposed and have had approved for the conference. Mine is about speculative legal theory and philosophy, and Swastee's is about aesthetics. And I don't have the whole title here, but we're going to get back to that.
Sensorial legalities.
Okay,
It's
sensorial.
aesthetics.
Yeah, cool, thanks. And yeah, we're going to like tell you about those at the end because paper submissions are open for the CLC, and you can submit your paper to different streams. So we're going to like take advantage of the opportunity to talk a little bit about these streams in case you're thinking about submitting presentations to the CLC. So yeah, Swastee is a he's a lecturer at the Exeter Law School and a researcher in the areas of law, aesthetics, and environment. And yeah, pass the mic to Swastee to talk to us a little bit, and then we're having a discussion.
Thank you, Tom, for having me and for giving me this opportunity to talk about some things that I've been working on for a while. Just thinking and giving us the space to actually think about how we can relate speculation with law, speculative activity, thinking with law. So the way I structured today's talk, or what I wanted to talk about, was I wanted to introduce object-oriented philosophy and open it as a site of conversation between me and Tom. Partly because I think that there's a lot of convergence in our thinking, but also because um, what is or what kind of relationship that object-oriented ontology can have with law is still very much for me a developing and emerging. So it'd be nice to have that as a conversation. So it's not a presentation. Having said that, I will sort of situate this work in my ongoing work to give it some form and to think about the theory from that place. Okay. So essentially, the idea of or the philosophy, what is known as object-oriented philosophy, emerges under the subset of the speculative realist turn in the late 1990s, early 2000s, mostly from mid 2000s, 2005, 2007. And the principal interlocutors for this movement, which is a big term to use, but movement was Graham Harman, Timothy Morton, Ian Bogost, Ian Hamilton Grant, Dave Brassier, Levi Bryant, especially his earlier work, most strongly associated with what is object-oriented philosophy. My own engagement with O is actually confined to Harman's approach. He is somebody who calls himself an object-oriented philosopher. And I'm also interlocuting, or I'm also interested in reading Harman through a debate or a conversation that he has with Stephen Shavito. And I think it was important for me to pitch this because there's a very important aspect of Harman's work that I think Shaviro responds more persuasively and gives us ways of thinking about triple O. So, a little situated, or where I come from, or why I've been interested in object philosophy. So my foray into triple O was motivated by my wider research on urban aesthetics and environment and law, particularly in relation to what is the interface between designing and law, urban design and law, and form of the city, so morphology. Um, so in that context, I was working with the work of Kevin Lynch. If people are aware of it, it's one of the most seminal pieces of work on the image of the city. That's the name of the book as well, and which interestingly was crucial for Frederick Jameson's work on cognitive mapping. And why I use Kevin Lynch's work even now and very persuasively is because Lynch uses this work to talk about legibility and clarity of the image of the city that appears in the register of the visual and in the interconnections between things that are existing in the city. For obviously for Lynch, it's a matter of things and objects also include people and the phenomenological experience of that image. So I was reading this book and I was thinking about objects in the city and I was thinking about what does it mean to say or to define for myself what is an object. And I think for me, it was the role of physical stationary objects that play in the city and their relationship to sense perception and significantly to the constitution of urban environment. So this is how I started thinking about what is the value or how do we think about objects in the city um, that is not reducible um, to literature and governance. And I'll come to it why this was important for me. So when I say objects, I usually mean things like streetlights and trees and benches, and really mundane objects. So the speculative tone emerges as a counter to the continental anti-realism, which was most popularly or most predominantly um, embodying linguistic and textual priority and representation through it, and therefore the speculative for the speculative realist, that was what was to be put in some sort of context, right? Like what is continental anti-realism, and how do we go beyond it? I read it like that, obviously, and I think one of the principal figures for that movement is Quentin Meillassous's work on After Finitude, which and especially his engagement with correlationism, which, as all of you may know, is the idea according to which we only ever have access to the correlation between thinking and being, and never to either of the term considered apart from each other. This idea of correlationism for Meillassoux is a very important starting point for his own thinking and philosophy. Um, and Meillassoux makes up that argument that up until Kantian philosophy, inquiries into materiality consisted in asking questions of nature, right? Like so, attributing it to either divine providence or to reveal some larger interconnection. However, since the Kantian revolution, correlationism has become the dominant dominion of consciousness and of language. So for Meillassoux, the question really that he engages with is whether there is a reality outside of this and how we may think of this kind of reality. So Harman also follows Meillassoux' description of correlationism and definition and concerns himself with what is the real, right? So first, quite for Harman, that principal um, question is of reality. And Harman himself is influenced actually by I think is primarily influenced by three philosophers: Martin Heidegger, Bruno Latour, and Alfred North Whitehead. Of course, Whitehead comes before Latour. And I think, but it's simplistic to reduce it down to this. I think the key figure in Harman's work is Martin Heidegger, and he reworks Heidegger's notion of tool being, or of the concept of tool being, which is readiness to hand. And he proposes a tool analysis a little bit different from Heidegger's tool analysis. I must say that in his work on tool being, Harman writes a lot of Heidegger's work. And so a lot of this is me paraphrasing his understanding of Heidegger. It is a question whether he reads Heidegger correctly or not, and that is part of a lot of philosophical engagement, whether Harman is correctly reading Heidegger. And I think it's worth pointing out that that is a site of of evolving criticism against Harman, but it is not yet. I wouldn't say it's something that I am particularly interested in. Maybe later. Maybe something I should come back to. So according to the tool analysis, it really is about the two-phase nature of tools themselves. So on the one hand, it is the realization that tools, and think of hammer striking a nail, is the silent drama of what he says force against force, which generates new world at every moment. So tools interact with each other and they anticipate a new world. On the other hand, they emerge into view through a specific perspective, right? So in this sense, tools are irreducible and they allow for a specific perspective to come through. And tool analysis tells us something more about the tools themselves than what it is that they're doing. So, and it's a very, very brief outline of what is tool analysis. But in fact, it's this that would center a lot of Harman's object-oriented philosophy. And and I think one of the first postulate of the triple of OOP is that all objects are equally objects. Though not all objects are equally real, we must distinguish between the autonomy of real objects and the dependence of essential objects on whatever encounters them. I quoted that. And I think what he's trying to say here is that objects are not cannot be quantified or qualified. They're irreducible both to its components and to its effect. Which is to say that as long as the object is not exhausted by undermining and overmining methods, I'll explain that in a second, an entity will qualify as an object. And I think the undermining and overmining method, dual mining method, is for Harman a way of stressing how we gather knowledge about objects, right? So what is it that determines for how we get knowledge or how we receive knowledge about objects. Undermining is an inquiry where object cannot account for, and I quote this, relative independence of objects from their constituent pieces or histories. So a phenomena, undermining can be understood as a phenomena of emergence, that they're part of something, nor is an object identical with the influences received from its environment. So an object is more than its components and hence cannot be paraphrased successfully by way of downward reduction. So you cannot keep going down to look for what is the object, because that is a never-ending process anyways. At what point, like the way to understanding undermining is that at what point will we reach the limits of atoms and physics of it, right? Like at what point we'll say it ceases to be. So And the problem with the overmining is to argue that object is nothing but its relation or discernible actions. In that, it allows objects to have no surplus reality beyond what they can modify, transform, or create. And the idea is that if objects were nothing more than their current expression in the world, and this is something that you can see an obvious influence of Latour on Harman, is that if objects were nothing more than their current expression in the world, they would not be able to do anything differently in time that follows. So there is no feedback loops can replace the need for an excess in things beyond their relation. That's what he says. And I think what he wants to say in the question of overmining, and I think Ian Hamilton Grant has a criticism of this particular concept, which is what pointing out to, is basically suggesting that if we are only going to describe objects by talking about it in terms of relations and in terms of its actions, we will never really understand what an object is. But more importantly, an object can emerge into multiple relations at multiple times, right? But what is it? It will still not explain what is it that is appearing in each of these multiple relations. Because everything, all that we know about the object is precisely located in the relationship, but not in the object. And there is no feedback loop that can replace the need for an excess in things beyond their relation. So because objects cannot absorb or respond to feedback unless, and this is really interesting way of phrasing it, and one of the really good things about Harman is it's fairly tries to make a very persuasive argument, is that he's trying to say that the only way objects can participate in multiple networks or multiple arrangements or multiple associations or relationships, centered relationship, is because it doesn't it must have something that allows it to be able to participate in these multiple relations, right? There has to be something more than what it currently does, so that if an object appears in a system, in a network of relations as, let's say, an orange, that same thing could also become fertilizer. What is it that allows an object to have and for Harman, the question is really um, the lack of understanding about the fact that there is something essential to the object. Now, okay, so he writes, he conceives the duo mining knowledge operation on object um, as a way to really explore or think or suggest of a reality which exists outside the mind. So it's about holding that reality exists outside the mind and we cannot know it. It's just that simple. We simply don't know what is it that allows object to participate in multiple plural relations. What we can say for sure is that they do. That is all we know. And the only thing that we can do in that regard is, and what Harman does is give a certain characteristic of passivity to the object, right? Like, so the recalcitrant object, the reticent object, the withdrawn object. And the reason why he attributes that withdrawnness is for me a way of explaining that cannot what we think cannot be expressed in a relationship still exists in multiple different sites. And so this is the so for him this is object oriented realism. And we can only gain access to this through indirect, elusive, or vicarious means, which means that the assertion is that not only does the reality exist outside the mind, but the reality exists as a surplus even beyond the causal interaction. So, for instance, if we look at, and I think he gives the example of dust and raindrop, if we see that the rain is falling on the floor on the ground, um, we can express it in the way of language and of how to animate these inanimate matters. But but we would never know for a fact what is it that the raindrop is to the falling floor. I don't know if that makes sense. It takes a bit. In some sense, then object oriented philosophy really seriously considers or tries to take very seriously the Kantian epithet of the thing in itself. So ultimately, what it is about the thing in itself. And and as Harman observes, I think it's worth talking about, is that whereas Kant insists that human cognition is finite and cannot reach the things as they are, these noumena can be thought but not known. Humans have direct access to phenomena, which implies that thing is more than what knowledge we have of it. So, so for Hammond, it's clearly, if 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 I may, it's quite clear that he believes that there is some sense of the big substance of Spinoza, and there is some sense of big substance of the monism of Leibniz, but we can see that. However, what is interesting for me and why I was thinking about Graham Harman's work um, in relation to my own inert objects was this idea of vicarious of accessing objects through elusive means, indirect means, through vicariousness. And I think the example, and I think worth pointing out that there's a example that he puts out where this is most clear about. Um, he's looking at Picasso's famous painting. I will butcher the pronunciation, but I should have done my homework. Sorry. Le Demoiselle d'Avignon, something like that. But let's see. It's a very famous painting. I know what the painting is. Um, but uh, for Harman, he does this thought experiment about a question that he asks actually is how we can paraphrase that painting in discursive terminology without losing something crucial about it. So, if the best art critics write allusively and elliptically, this is not because they are facile mystics or irrational frauds, but because their subject matter demands nothing less. And he writes that good writing is not just clear and devoid of fuzziness, and it must also be vivid writing that brings its subject to life rather than replacing it with bundles of explicit and verifiable qualities. Sometimes we can only reveal things obliquely, looking for paradox rather than literally accurate predicates as as our entryway to a thing. And this is for me was was where Harman really is very persuasive, which is that at the heart of Harman's object-oriented philosophy is a dedication to recovering aesthetics as the first form of philosophy, right? Like, what is it? And he establishes aesthetics as first of philosophy precisely by engaging in this status of inert objects and objects in the world. It is striking to see that Harman actually insists on three things. One, that objects are dormant, they're partially available to reality, they are withdrawn. Um, Second is how to question linear causality, where cause and effect are not necessarily correlated, and his insistence upon more descriptions of the object. So when Harman asks us to reconsider Picasso's painting, we may draw attention to the elusive nature of that description or the affective nature of this description. So, in a speculative rendering of the object, Harman draws attention to the unrepresentability of things in a reality. And I think this is the withdrawn is the site of the speculative part of his work, advocating for rethinking of inert bodies, not as something that has nothing to it, but um, which remains withdrawn. So it is in a different context. I think Harman also um, can be read alongside if withdrawnness is about holding back or thinking about recalcitrant object. It's also about revelation. So I think Harman also can be read as somebody who's engaged in talking about encounters and what happens at encounters. It's an inexhaustible. So the other big influence on Harman's conception of object-oriented philosophy is obviously actor network theory. And I think the one important thing from Latour that he takes is the argument that he accepts that all objects are ontologically similar. There is no distinction between different objects. However, in so doing, it abolishes any hidden depth in things, reducing objects merely to their action. Quote close. Harman argues that this relational and agentic understanding of object obfuscates relations that exist outside of human thinking and being, that is, of relations where humans have no role to play. For Harman, a truly pro-object theory needs to be aware of relations that exist between objects that have no direct involvement with people. And for me, this is really one of the things that struck while I was thinking about the city and the things that are found in the city, because I was really thinking of the city not merely as what humans use it for, what is a planning for, or what is a design for, well, what happens or what is the interconnections between objects in the city? So how does the weed that grows in our footpath actually recognizes what is that relationship? What is happening there? Um, and what does it mean for me as a human subject to intervene in that? So this so objects here for Harman are only actors called upon action does not sufficiently answer what they are when they're not acting. So that's the human predicate, right? Like humans give that motion to the objects. And to treat objects solely as actors forget that the thing acts because it exists rather than existing because it acts. And there's and so this is how I think this is a very brief template of what is object-oriented philosophy. To conclude the bit on Harman, I would like to remind, one of the things that is very, very important about Harman's philosophy is that it's actually a philosophy of immaterialism and not so much as materialism, where stability is the norm, right? Like because everything is withdrawn from each other and only available to us through the description, through elusive means, and through vicarious causation, um, it's immaterialism that we are eventually talking about. The thing in itself is precisely for Harman located in an indirect and elusive or vicarious means. The account of awareness that Harman seeks in a truly object-oriented theory is found in the rejection of an immanence that is built around change. And so Harman's account on objects appear often as a critique of philosophies of change and becoming. Yet criticism like these do not allow us to really take seriously the metaphysical contribution that he wants to make, which is his views on aesthetics as a primary mode of understanding, apprehending, and being aware of objects. And I think this is where I felt like Stephen Shaviro's conversation with Harman um, is useful to bring out that bit of his aesthetics um, more in terms of object-oriented philosophy. And just a brief background on Steven Shaviro. He's a film and media theorist, um, uh, and a lot of his writing is Whitehead inspired, Deleuze and Guattari, um, and and I think his his work also will illuminate the aesthetic bit of object-oriented philosophy. For Shavino, the metaphysical inquiry of Harman and Whitehead actually can be brought together through aesthetics. The speculative realism that Shavino aspires to considers both these thinkers alongside the work of Kant and Meillet as a work that focuses not mostly on epistemological questions, but rather directly on aesthetics. Therefore, it must be situated before knowledge, because aesthetics is, according to Shaviro, the realm of immanent non-cognitive contact. And I think one of the easiest ways of that interlocution and debate is to see Shaviro's engagement with Harman's allure as a philosophy, as a term. Um, and Shaviro describes this, and he paraphrases Harman's description. And I quote, an object is alluring when it not only displays particular quality, but also insinuates the existence of something deeper, something hidden and inaccessible. To be allured is to be beckoned into a realm that cannot ever be reached. Um, for him, for Shavira, this definition is very close to Whitehead's expression of lures of feeling, which is essentially in some way anything that wants to capture my attention, entice me, seduce me, tempt me, compel me, something like that is where he thinks that they're similar. And the lure, of course, in Whitehead's metaphysics is what Whitehead calls a proposition, which is something that holds sway over me. It is something that holds forth the prospect of difference. And this potentiality is, I'm quoting from Whitehead actually, is always anchored in a group of things. So for this, so for what does this idea of allure does to realist ontology, or a theory that is committed to exploring the relationship between objects instead of objects and the human experience? If we do think of objects and the human experience, it will fall back to a correlationist circle, and more importantly, will adduce that we cannot think of things outside of our experience. We need to understand how Shavira and Harman understand what happens between objects when human beings are not involved. In Harman's object-oriented theory, it is very much the allure of vicarious causation. And this is an understanding of causal effects that are produced as a result of the aesthetic encounter between objects. That is, when objects interact with each other, this interaction is primarily an aesthetic encounter, which upon human experience becomes a matter of establishing cause and effect. Aesthetics here is ontological precisely because it unfolds as a transformation without changing the hidden and the withdrawn quality of objects. It does not seek to challenge or contest it, and for that would only establish a causal relationship. In fact, for Shaviro, on the contrary, it is evident, and I'll quote this, that a thing may affect me without my having access to the inner quality of the thing. For even if you know nothing of my inner life, your action may well affect it profoundly. I'm always being affected and altered by things that call me or superficially encounter me. Indeed, these things affect my inner life precisely because they remain separate from me. I cannot simply incorporate them within myself. And I think it's very clear to see that this is it. He uses in the same paragraph, he uses the word It has a distinct aesthetic effect on me through its aroma and taste. It's very easy to see that this is a rendition of affect, which is similar to Spinoza's definition of affect. And but and we can obviously talk about where new materialist and posthumanist stand. But I think in the speculative realist account, there is an unbridgeable distance from which affect occurs. And this unbridgeable distance means that every side of every encounter always recognizes that there is something beyond and outside of itself and myself. So in some sense, it resists assimilation into terms that defines a coherent system. This does not mean, and I think I'm almost, yeah, just last point. This does not mean that there are no real objects. On the contrary, it means that there are real objects that can be accessed as a matter of aesthetic and their impact on human experience. The problem with Harman's critique of relationality, as it appears through the work of Netork, for instance, is that it is always construed in perception. And for Shavino, that is not the case. For not only relationality does not always mean perception, it does mean that we do encounter things. A touch does happen, a aesthetic contact is established. Even outside knowledge, on a level, and I quote, beneath the threshold of cognitive perception, beyond its capacities to recognize or relate. This is most often construed as a matter of responding to an object, but Shaviro insists that the response to the object is essentially a matter of non-cognition. The fact that we establish it as in human perception, in fact, is misleading. It's one of the many aesthetic encounters that can happen, but there are other kinds of encounters that exceed phenomenological intentionality. Um, and this is very similar. In that sense, one can read Deleuze's encounter into it. So, in this account of object-oriented philosophy, reality emerges or is precipitated on this twin movement of encounters and withdrawals. Encounters because that is established, but withdrawal because it allows objects to participate in multiple plural relationalities. And the encounter does not do away with objects, rather, it allows us to concede that this is not exhaustive. It is one of many such encounters that are possible, and neither can it claim a causality because these encounters may lead to some other things. Becoming itself is continuous, the Whiteheadian. So that's what object oriented philosophy is. And it has been, it has obviously been critically engaged with on multiple fronts. And I think one of the three important critiques or point of contention is one is obviously Grant's idea of bipolarity of matter, that the substance, that we're thinking of objects only in terms of potency and its conditioning. So we're still thinking of bipolarity. And it suggests that we never think of the conditions in which objects appear. The second really important critique of object oriented philosophy, as far as Harman is concerned, although it's not truly fair, especially if, I don't know, I'll leave that for you to decide, is lack of politics. And I think Alexander Galloway makes these points in these earlier renditions of Harman's work, where it's evident that it's this framework of talking about object is very much within an ontological liberalism, right? And because it is based on this idea of discreteness, on the idea of moving of relationality from this picture. In my work, and I think I'm going to stop it in just a minute. In my work, I think the way I look at object-oriented philosophy and law is precisely by reworking an aesthetic account of law, which obviously moves beyond representation, but can also attest to the stagnant inertness of things, just uh, to attend to that inertness, only in terms of allowing a legal, an aesthetic account of law to emerge where it can take into consideration more pluralities. Um, I think there's also, for me, what is visible to me in this account of law and law increasingly is that objects themselves are jurisgenerative. And what does it mean for any object to say it's jurisgenerative? Is to suggest that law is encoded within the object itself. That which establishes a relation has a normative dimension, has an affective capacity to orient thinking of environment. And here, obviously, I'm thinking of Andres Philippopolis' work, which has been extremely important and perhaps one of the first forays to really seriously consider object-oriented philosophy within legal studies. Um, and I think for me, an object-oriented law, if at all, no, actually, yes, I do propose an object-oriented law as an exercise of thinking about an affective aesthetics, which not only relies on encounter alone, but in the withdrawal of objects, and thereby centering the importance and value of sensorialities and affectivities, um, but also considering in deeper ways the value of unconcealment or withdrawnness, or that duality of withdrawnness and concealment, along with obviously empiricism. Like, this is one of those work that really pushes us to consider what is in another way of approaching of reality. So yeah, so those are some of my general field of thinking about what is object-oriented philosophy. I feel like I've been talking for very long. I'm sorry.
No problem, Swastee. Thanks so much for this introduction. I have two themes that I would like to address. I think I'm going to just put one of them out there, and I'm going to tell people to, like, if you have questions or interventions that you would like to make in this debate, you can. I think in order to make this more organized, we can use the raising hand thing that Zoom has down there. I think you can find it. And well, also, if you think you have something that is very, concise and concerning something that is being said at one precise moment, I think it's also something useful to just interrupt and say something so we can make it more conversational. But if you do that, just don't take the just don't keep talking forever. Reasonability. But yeah, so what I thought about two things, as I said, thinking about how in my mind I can think about correlating this to legal problems. You got to this at the end, and I think what you said about like law being encoded within the object itself is probably like the core of stuff that could be unpacked there. Like how do we extract the consequences of this? Like, what are the consequences for legal thought of this idea of law being encoded within the object itself, even though the object withdraws and isn't necessarily accessible to us, right? So what does
Yeah,
it mean to think about this law that exists in a way that is inaccessible to us, but doesn't, for that reason, exist any less, right? Because
yeah,
I think one problem with like what I would call the legal version of correlationism, right, which is like the big problem in Western philosophy that the speculative turn sort of reacts to, right,
yeah,
is that we often see traditional and even critical legal thought jumping from the idea that there's no way that we can account for our knowing of something as law to the fact that there's no law there.
Yeah,
So there's these indigenous people here, we can't really make sense of them having law, then they must be lawless. Or
yeah.
there's this
Or the corollary of that is then at what point what becomes law? Uh,
mm,
like it follows from exactly your point. Like at what point we think that this is where law is and ends, and this is not law, right?
mm,
So,
yeah,
and it's legal ontology
yeah,
or ontology of law. That is a better way of saying that.
yeah,
Ontology. Um, yeah. So no, I think the way I have mobilized it in my work is precisely in that vein. Um, but it it but the problem with this is, as far as it's been working on it for a very long time. So, but the problem with this is that at some point, to to constitute or to suggest that this is law or that is not law is also a question of accountability and bodies and politics. Um, and I mean, at least I look at it. Or, in other words, does is the object also the subject? Um, and I don't want to like bring. I don't care for the binary at all, but it's just important to remember that um, the notion of withdrawnness often would imply, or the notion of stagnancy often, or resisting change, like at least in this framework. So be really careful about where we draw. Well, I'll talk about this later. Let's I can go on
yeah.
it.
So I was saying this because you know, I keep trying to mediate these problems that come from contemporary speculative theory into legal theory. And usually I try to
Yeah,
do that through some legal author that I feel has a connection with that. And since, you know, I don't know about object oriented ontology a lot, like it's one of the currents within speculative theory that I know the less about. But I think one thing that makes it special or specific within speculative theory in a more general sense is the connection to Heidegger. So you get to the
yeah,
speculative theory, you
yeah,
get to the object centricity and all that through a certain modification of Heidegger, whereas in other places you're going to get there through other different paths.
yeah.
And when I think about bringing that into legal theory, the closest connection that appears to me is through Schmidt. Um,
I knew
there's a
you were
lot
going
of
to say
differences
something.
between Schmidt and Heidegger, but there's also, I think, a lot of similarities. And one of them is that I think
Yeah,
Schmidt's idea of law, especially in the Nomos of the Earth, which I think is the more interesting part of Schmidt to like speculative legal theory. You get this idea that before becoming abstracted into codes and into abstract norms and language, law emerges from a sort of phenomenological relation between man and the earth that is also mediated by artifacts. So he starts the Nomos of the Earth saying two things that I think are important. One is that his idea of nomos, and this comes a little bit later actually, but one thing is that his idea of nomos is supposed to be anterior to the differentiation between nomos and physis. And this I think helps because I think one problem with trying, like when I listening to you talking about object-oriented ontology, and that also applies to speculative realism more generally, I feel the main difficulty in order to bringing that into law is that mostly they're concerned with knowledge of objects in a way that is more like in terms of science or epistemology or knowledge and you know grasp of reality, and less in terms of normativity or and
yeah.
you know in
There's
this
often it's absolutely missing actually.
yeah
So I mean, I do that in my work, like my this is my work, right? So this is my
it's the challenge that we are trying to deal with, right?
it's like I can have but yeah, so definitely what you said, I completely agree with you that there is that relationship between homosynthesis that we can, and especially the anterior. I never thought of it actually like that, but now you say that.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah,
because Schmidt is working with this idea that his idea of law is independent of the relation between nomos and physis, I think this may help us, sort of bring this into legal thought. And then he talks about this idea of he sort of tells this story about law emerging in a sort of local agricultural community, and that has three layers. And
yeah,
the first layer is that the earth, and he says that the earth is the mother of law. So the first thing that he says, that the earth has within itself the has a norm, but this norm is still sort of just a possibility. And then in the second moment, it is like man's work, and I think this is a very masculine version of man. Man's work sort of makes this law that is like passive within the earth to manifest in the form of structures such as bridges and fences and stuff like that. So a lot of objects that are composing this sort of environment.
yeah.
And then the present of those objects is a sort of concrete form of law, because it's going to structure the way that our conducts are going to be happening in that territory. So the law is sort of embedded in those objects. And then the thing that I think would be, just to conclude my like argument that I'm trying to make, the analogy or the parallelism that I would do with Schmidt and the Heideggerian theme here would be that this in Schmidt still maintains this very anthropocentric, like human exceptionalism, in which the only way the nomos appears is through human action over passive matter, which then creates this
Yeah,
legal
but
nomic
wouldn't that, yeah,
interface. And then if you do the same sort of move that Harman is doing in relation to Heidegger, then you could say that it's not just the human acting upon nature that creates this gnomic concrete law, this legal interface, but actually all objects as they relate to each other build this kind of concrete normative interface in a way that is like multilateral, that's
plural.
what I was thinking about. Yeah, and I just wanted to know if that says anything to you, if you think that makes
No,
sense.
it does. I mean, this was, I did not use Schmidt for reasons, different reasons, but I came to the same conclusions through reading, um, through thinking about withdrawal and encounter and problematizing it through Deleuze and Spinoza, and thinking about connect and normativity and law and all of that through that. Because for me, um, the thing that interests me is how do we think of inertness of an object? Is it possible to think of an inertness of an object where we are not there, where we simply, and so how do we center that in the legal or in thinking about the law, right? Like why? And I also feel like it's not necessary for law to what we identify as law to be bothered with it. Which is why I think Spinoza's conatus makes more sense to me, because what it does as a normativity, as a form, is really talking about a force that is not always in the encounter expressed. All of it is not expressed in the encounter itself, but makes for movement, which sort of maps out. Um, I'm using the word literally, flow of the object, right? So I came through it. I came through that, and I think it's partly because I find that more persuasive rather than thinking about it in terms of earth and land, and the breaches are the first of land, and therefore, because I often feel like Schmidt's work is highly colonial in its rendering and in its imagination. And I don't think that we should not read him, but I also think that how do we say that without expressing it? Or because that's the problem with Harman's work also, which is extremely masculine, extremely based on a on a violence almost of withdrawnness, of discretion, and of Hindu. But I think the thing that was persuasive to me is the aesthetic alludes vicarious causation is very interesting for me. But yeah, I'm gonna leave it. Still, I'm thinking with you, so I'm not making much sense right now. But yeah, Sabrina.
Thank you for your presentation, Swastee. Just kind of, I mean, I've kind of already expressed to you that I know very little about object-oriented ontology. I have read quite a bit of Shaviro, have read Harman's work, have read Latour's work, but still kind of really uncomfortable with object-oriented philosophy in general. But as you were kind of talking, it made me think about things that I've read already, and I was trying to make connections between them. And I'm just wondering if you are familiar with Elizabeth Gross's work on the incorporeal, and where she talks about the kind of immaterial characteristics or features of material objects, right? Essentially, things like time, space, sense, all these things that kind of form, like I think she calls it the framing conditions of materiality, which themselves are immaterial. And in a sense, when she talks about that, it kind of makes me think of law in a sense, right? Because law is about the encounter and how we encounter objects, and how we determine the kind of ideal image of that object based on how we encounter it. And I'm just kind of wondering if you have any thoughts on like her work on incorporeality and how it kind of connects to the kind of like work that you've been reading around object-oriented ontology.
A huge part of my work is actually mapping new materialist scholars, posthumanist, alongside object-oriented. And specifically, when I talk about object-oriented, I'm actually talking about Graham Harman's work. Because I feel like there is a lot that is happening in his work that can, and I think I use Shavino's work. For me, it was very, very important to find Stephen Shavino's work, because I felt like that is the link that establishes Harman between why not posthumanism, why not new materialism, and why object-oriented philosophy, right? Like, why are you doing it?
Yeah.
And I think it's a very important question. And I think, and I read Elizabeth Gross's work also in that vein, but there are, I don't disagree with anything. Sure, we can think of it in that term. The thing is that what is really interesting is for me to think about withdrawnness and not encounter, right? Like something that is hidden, that is concealed, that is not revealed, and everything is. It's like, is that important to think? That's the thing, and that withdrawnness is essentially a textured version of I don't know, of decipherment, or of what kind of things we can do to decipher it. Like, so if everything is available to us, um, in the immaterial, in the aesthetic, it still retains that inexhaustion. So I'm constantly struggling to propose a way of thinking that does not exhaust itself at the level of encounter. So the encounter is plural possibilities, right? Like it is made up of plural possibilities. It is made up of different kinds of immaterialities. How do we propose how do we think of object-oriented philosophy that actually retains that multiple pluralities? This is a question of unrepresentability, and this is not a new question. That's the other thing. It's definitely not something that only Harman and Shavi, and it's part of intellectual history of ideas, that this is a question that has been, not everything is given. And so I don't have any disagreements with Cross's work. I cite her work immensely. I think it's really useful, especially in thinking about bodies and in thinking about encounters and thinking about affect, thinking about what moves us, and if law is that kind of normative force that allows us to move and to experience sensorially or be immersed in it. I just think that great, but it's still, but I could just abandon withdrawnness if I abandon it. Like, why is that such an important thing? And actually, withdrawnness is a big part of Heidegger's concealment and unconcealment, and is the part of his his own dialogues with what is the revelation of the truth. So at the heart of it is that question, I feel, which I'm very scared to touch with a barge pole. But it's just like I take that route towards aesthetics precisely to. I'm not scared, but it's just one of those things that is really worth thinking about, and which the posthumanism, at least the kind of posthumanism that we're talking about here, actually they do talk about withdrawnness, but in a different way, but not in terms of inexhaustion, but mostly pluralities, maybe, or multiplicities, or
They do talk a lot about dormancy, like the dormant reality, and Bennett talks a lot about like the idea of the swerve, right? Things, parameters of within something exists, changes.
But all of that rests upon primarily on the condition that it will be encountered.
Yeah.
So that's the other question of like, how do we represent dormancy and recalcitrance? And what is the value of thinking about it? Like I said, that this as a metaphysical inquiry, what is the value of thinking about withdrawnness? So yeah. Do you want to add anything, Tom, to that?
No, I was just thinking about bringing in the other thing that I thought about in the beginning, because I also think that it sort of connects to Sabrina's interests as well, which is, I was thinking about whether you connect in some way what you are discussing about the city, like now coming to to the more applied, more concrete part that you brought at the end, but the application of this object-oriented law idea to cities. I was thinking about the emergence of smart cities, and how the way these kind of algorithmic governance procedures, which are sort of co-developing with artificial intelligence, in the sense that both machine learning processes are used to sort of determine the norms that are going to be applied in different situations, and they're also being fed back by those data capturing and sensorial input points that are distributed around the cities. So you have a sort of a governance machine that is working on and through all of those progressively smart objects that are distributed all around the city. And that is, to me, interesting in the sense that it is a sort. It's something that I would like to consider as law or as nomos in an expanded sense. I mean, it's not law in the modern strict sense of law. It's not the kind of thing that Carlson would call law, but I think it's a way of organizing and distributing norms and conducts, like correlating norms and conducts, and those are both human and non-human actions, conducts. And I think it's interesting in the sense in which it puts the human, because like if we're talking about being, it's easier to say that all objects are in the same sense, in the way that object-oriented ontology does. But when you're talking about law, because law is specifically considered by us humans as a specifically human thing, then you're like, yeah, but this thing is only going to have rights, or it's only going to have law in as much as our law talks about it. But when it comes to this kind of governance, it seems really clear that the way it works puts actually humans and non-human objects at the same statute, in the sense that the way my conducts are regulated by those things is based on data that is extracted from my conducts and then is circled back upon them. And then the way it happens, the way it regulates the conducts of a fridge or of a car is not that different, because there's nothing specific about the legal person. There's nothing specific about being able to communicate through language, or being able to express like rational decisions or anything like that, because the way this kind of governance work just bypasses that and considers everything as just a spectrum of probability of things happening in the world, right? So in a way, I think this sort of combination between smart cities and algorithmic governance might be somewhere in which this way of looking at law and object-oriented law in cities might become more
I
obvious.
worked on smart street poles, and a bit of my thesis was on smart street poles and what is it to say smartness. And um, but I was still in, at least as far as my PhD was concerned, which is when I started thinking of these things. I was not interested in normativity till then, and I was still thinking about it in terms of design and planning and discretion of the discreteness of the object, the felt sense of the object, the object that exists. So for me, it was like, how do you think of law that exists for a bird in the city, right? Like we have these visuals of birds making nests in multiple in multiple corners of the city. So what does that? What is it about? Like in Delhi, where my thesis was situated, oftentimes you would see dogs sitting underneath the street light for security actually. I don't know why they were sitting, but they used the light, right? Like, so I use the word quote unquote. um and I was thinking about that kind of relationship where, and these are stray dogs. So I'm thinking about that kind of relationship that exists between things, and what does it mean to think about aesthetics of the object, and what does it mean to think about it in the context of urban design and the interface of the city, the visual language of the city. Um, so I sort of started there, and then I ended up a part of my work was actually just thinking about smart objects, because Delhi as a city is infiltrated with smart objects. And the question of how much can you know about this object is actually ridiculous, because where does the smart object start? What is the origin of a smart object in the like of Levi Bryant, Sonduk? Like, how do you map a smart object? Is it the interface, or is it the data, or is it? It's already an object that is crumbling. right? Like it's not inert in the way we understand anything, but it's also more active, and there is um, a very, very strong political economy of it, right? Like, so it's a whole part of a capitalist, extractive capitalist, technological universe. And so you had to, and so then, how does this object circulate would have been a very different thesis, but a thesis that I'm going to write into a book. Um, so yeah, so that is something that I have thought quite a lot about. I mean, you're right. It's a very, very persuasive point. But I think for me, it was the question of designing of the object, and still is a question of form. I keep thinking if there is something here about the legal form itself, and what does that do? So yeah. Okay.
Anyone else want to do some comments before we move into the CLC part?
Hi, Manu. Hi, Feva.
Hello.
How are you?
Tired.
Okay,
Yes.
this is
Well, yeah, I mean, we still have half an hour. Maybe we should go into the discussion of our streams. So yeah, thanks, Swastee, again for
absolutely.
centering this discussion about object-oriented law.
I do want to say, Tom, I did not mention your fire and the cotton experiment that Harman talks about in his various places. He talks about the fire and the cotton ball.
Yeah.
And the reason I did not mention it is because I thought it's a bit of a escape route for him to declare. It's a good example, though. So yeah.
Well, I think we could start the CLC. Well, first, yeah, as I mentioned in the beginning, this year's Critical Legal Conference is themed Speculations. It's being organized by Yannicka Kahl, who is also a part of our network. And it sort of reflects, we think, hope, that our efforts as a speculative legal theory network to sort of call interest and gain momentum for this idea of bringing speculative thoughts, new materialism, object-oriented thought, ontological turn, this kind of thing into legal theory is sort of working in some way and growing and all that. Last year we had just a couple streams on the CLC that talked about this, and now the whole conference is going to be talking about it. If you search on Google, you're going to find a critical legal thought blog post about conference. It's also at the Lund University website, and in particular we wanted to talk about these two streams that Swastee and I have separately submitted, and that are both now accepted and receiving open to receive presentation proposals. It's really simple. You just have to send us an abstract, and I'm going to just read here the two descriptions. First, Swastee's. Swastee has proposed this stream collectively with Julia Chrysostalis, Yorgos Evgenios Douliakas, and Lucy Finchett Maddock, and it's titled. Sorry.
Yeah.
That right? Okay. It's
Yeah.
titled Sensorial Legalities, Speculating Aesthetics and Art/Law. Do you think I read the whole description for each one, or just?
No, I think what is important is that this stream was basically thinking about law's relationship to sensorialities, to affect, to aesthetics, to various modes of representation. they often, we are looking at submissions that would explore some of speculative fiction, law literature, but also any ways you want to interpret that question of what is speculative aesthetics, and if there is a speculative aesthetics for law, most welcome. We do have it's on the website, the description. I think that would be useful.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Okay, so I'm just going to also talk like real quick without reading the whole thing. You can go there and read if you want, whether you're here or watching this retrospectively on YouTube. So the one that I propose is titled Speculative Legal Theory and Philosophy. And the idea is that the specificity of it is this focus on more philosophical and theoretical aspects of the relation between speculation and legal thought. So basically, we're interested in any kind of more theoretical or philosophical discussion that brings posthumanism, new materialism, object-oriented ontology, accelerationism, ontological turn, speculative realism, etc., assemblage theory, actual network theory, process philosophy, any of those references into legal fields or brings those concepts to bear on legal concepts and legal problems. And yeah, I think the quick sort of version of it is that. So there's also the question that, I think it's framed in a way also on the basis of this idea that we often talk about, that we are both like speculative legal theory, the way we are thinking about it here. It's sort of obviously like as an actual fact, as an actual movement emerges from within critical legal theory. So there's a continuity, there's an obvious continuity and an obvious like internal character of it within critical legal theory. And this is expressed also by the fact that this conference and these streams, it's within the critical legal conference. So in this sense, speculative legal theory is within critical legal theory and continuing critical legal theory. But also, if you look at the philosophical sense of speculation, traditionally in the history of philosophies, especially since Kant, speculation has appeared in contrast to critique. So critique arrives in a way as a way to limit speculation, which is seen as unwarranted, like the access to things themselves is seen as problematic. And then the Kantian Copernican revolution means that you have to start with the problem of access, as Swastee was talking about at the beginning when introducing the speculative realist movement. So in a way, this speculative turn has to do with getting outside of this Kantian problem once again and talking about things themselves in terms of things themselves and not in terms of how human beings or the human mind are able to access or to know or to understand those things. So in a way, the idea would be to address not only what this speculative legal theory can be on the basis of bringing those different influences into legal thought, but also how to understand this ambiguous relation of both continuity and rupture, both internal and external relation between speculative legal theory and critical legal theory. So yeah, like if anyone has any comments or questions about that, if you want to just talk about anything relating to the conference, or if you have ideas about papers that you would like to send either to the conference or to our streams in particular, we can take advantage of these last minutes to discuss that a little bit. There's I think it's still until the end of next month, so 1 month now to submit paper proposals, and I think I mean last year they hadn't announced at the beginning that remote presentations are possible, but they ended up being possible. So I think even if you're not able to attend in Sweden, you might still be able to send papers. So yeah, anyone want to say anything?
I think they can write to us. They want.
Yeah, maybe it's too much to just think about it right now. I just thought that maybe someone would want to come on and talk about something instead. Oh, Hermano said that I just answered his question on remote attendance. Yeah, I'm not sure. Do you know, Swastee, whether there's going to be remote
I have
presentation or not?
so far. I mean, we just have to check with the organizers one day.
Yeah,
I know
I
it
did
says
hear.
online that that papers can be presented remotely. It's just up to the panel organizers to
Oh, great.
ensure
You
that's
can
set up.
present it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so if you're sending to my panel, then I think it's good. Like you can present remotely.
Okay, thank you. That's I mean, it's a worst case scenario, but it's always good to know
Mhm.
that
Yeah.
there's this opportunity.
Yeah, and thanks Sabrina for letting us know. I hadn't checked that specifically, hadn't paid attention to that information, but often people don't say that up at the beginning because then a lot of people just don't even consider going. So it's nice to try to make people go, and then sort of last minute people go and allow it anyway. Well, so should we wrap it up? Or does anyone want to say anything about object-oriented law that you still were thinking about or something like that?
I'm very fascinated by Swastee's presentation. I'm wondering if you can refer to us like a bunch of key readings to dig into
I
this
wish.
topic.
I wish it's on record, but I wish like I could just. I mean, thinking about I should put some of this work in the Word, right? I think one of the easiest, one of the coolest things about Harman is that he actually writes really, really lucidly and uh, there's a slim volume that he has called Immaterialism for Harman, which is very simple and easy. And then Stephen Shaviro's The Universe of Things. Is that what it's called? The Universe of Things. You can just check for a second. But I think that is a really good book.
Yeah, The Universe of Things.
Yeah, Universe of Things. It's a great book. I didn't get time to talk about Ian Bagost's Alien Phenomenology, which I think is also very good as an introduction. Or more than an introduction, actually. It's a great book. And then finally, the open access volume on the speculative turn. Very accessible, I think, to an extent, but also really summarizes some of the key debates. Harman writes a lot, so you can find a lot of his stuff online elsewhere. One of the interesting things is that this speculative realist art did have a lot of blog presence at the time, so between 2006 2012. So if you just look up, I don't know, like Stephen Shaviro had a blog post called Pinocchio Theory, I think, and Levi had larval subjects. If you just type them out, you can see some of their conversations as they were unfolding at the time. So yeah, I think those are some of my top favorite things to read. Actually, I really enjoy reading those things, and
Thank you.
are very good introduction. Yeah, of
Mm.
course.
Mm.
As for Favor's question about what is
Yeah.
the distinction between OOO and a actor network theory, I think for Harman, actor network theory is essentially about four things. It's one of which is four characteristics, right? That it has actors, that their objects have agency, the irreducible, that relations are
Mm.
what is important and that it mediates. Translation, that when objects in an active network theory, um, when they establish a relation, they are establishing them of making it work for each other. So they're translating the object for the purpose of establishing a relation. And finally, association. Um, and I think the key difference between and so Harman characterizes ANT like this. And I use ANT because that's how I remember it. Academic theory like this. But I think one of the major point of difference is that critique of relationality. And so Harman says that you cannot say that objects are everything that is expressed in relation because that is only one aspect of what objects are. In fact, objects have something that they would that they keep in reserve. That not relationships do not relations do not exhaust the meaning of object. Corollary to that would be that just because there is the idea of attributing agency is it's an epistemological move, like it's an epistemic move to attribute agency. And so that doesn't also tell us what is an object. Um, so the way to understand that relationship for me was basically Harman saying that actually it is very important. Actor network theory is really important for a lot of reasons, but not for explaining what is an object. That makes sense? I think that's the best way to explain um, that distinction.
Mm.
And it's really, I think there is something about thinking about mediation. So a lot of actor network theory is about mediation, um, and about how objects mediate in the world and stabilize the world, right? Like so, um, that's where Harman is. Yeah, it is post. Well, is it post phenomenology? uh, who I'm thinking of, who does a really incredible job of using some of factor network theory to understand law is somebody called Kyle McGee, who uses chains of associations and is a fabulous book on Latour is actually priceless because it really explains how um, relations are established. And he uses this metaphor, which I think even uses this metaphor of the hook. And he says that an object attaches itself to a hook, but not to the entire object itself. So in a network, in a relation, it's only a partial object that appears, and the other thing is it's nothing but the hook. And I think it's he uses the term vincula juris to explain the chains of relations that are established. And I find this image of the hook really, really interesting because it's precisely what the hook is not, is what for Harman would be the withdrawnness, the or for others, potentiality and potency. So does that make sense, Favor? Like I think that's not so.
I was thinking about this also, like even preparing for our conversation, just like looking at some of Harman's stuff again. This debate with Chaviro and this thing with Latour. There's something that I feel, I mean, I tend to be as a more sort of delusion minded person. I tend more to this Chaviro, Latour, Whitehead side than to being really convinced by Harman's position in relation to withdrawal. Like, I mean, the way
Sure.
I understand the relation is that the withdrawal is what makes the whole difference. Like for
I mean, you could
Harman,
use
that
the
has,
word,
sorry.
yeah, you're right. Like you could use the word becoming and constantly changing and unfolding to explain exactly what, um, I don't know, texture, but yeah, sorry.
Yeah, no, but I don't even mean that it's sort of reducible. I think there is actually a difference in the sense that Harman is sort of saying there
Yeah,
is
of
something
course.
that is not reducible to the things correlative becoming each other. Like in a Deleuzian or Whiteheadian universe, you can think that
Yeah,
everything is
okay.
just like co-becoming. There's no being. There's just like things becoming each other, and then that's what constitutes them, and there's no need for having something that is unique to this object and that withdraws and that doesn't have any relation to any other object, but sort of, if I understood it correctly, it's sort of necessary, as you were saying, to explain that this object, like when it is correlated with different objects, there is some kind of constancy that makes it still be the same object. And to me, I don't really feel that that element is necessary, because the fact of the multiple relations that are constitutive of this object, or the networks or the becomings or the rhizomes that are constitutive of this object, when it relates to one particular object, those other relations don't go away. So they are still exerting this weight that is necessary to determine the specificity of this object as not reducible to all the different correlations. Harman makes this point that Latour would still be anthropocentric because he's only thinking about things as they relate. But if you don't center that on the human form of knowing it, if you think of it as just a network of relations with any different kinds of multiple entities or becomings, then I don't really see why the withdrawal would be necessary.
I don't disagree. I have struggled with this a lot. But I'm still holding on to it and hoping that it explains to me something. And this is that is going to be the paper that I want to present. This was just a conversation on object-oriented philosophy, and I wanted this to basically be the point at which I explain what it is, not about what my position is.
Yeah, I can feel from
It's
what
like
you're saying that you have a
I don't. I think for me there were a lot of unpacking to do to read Harman and to, because I also think of myself more. Um, I don't know. I would say I think of myself as Deleuze. I sound qualifying.
Yeah, it
But
does seem to me
definitely
like you have
inspired
also
by,
like an affinity with Shaviro and with other positions, not
of
like
course, like
a hard
100%.
like Harman defender or something like that.
No, no,
Doesn't
no.
sound like
I
that
think
at all.
I find Shaviro's work. In fact, he goes on to propose um, a much more robust way of thinking for me, normative questions. So yeah, favor.
Hello,
Hi.
everyone. Sorry, I can't put on my camera right now, today. But I wanted to ask, what you, well, since you mentioned that you were also looking at, you were interested in like law and the environment and aesthetics, and I was wondering because what when it comes to, I suppose, certain approaches towards not protecting, I suppose conserving the environment and all that. I often feel like one approach that I have seen being employed is one that sort of positions the environment as or nature as I suppose a distinct sort of realm of being or
Yeah.
or yes, realm of being or something.
Yeah.
Something like that. That is not necessarily not inert,
Yeah.
but as possessing its own interiority, its own identity. And I wondered if this was sort of the way you thought about the relationship, if you thought that a relationship between object-oriented ontology and the environment exists this way. But then on the other hand, some of the ways that I have seen people think about it is quite, I suppose, rather religious. But what you said about object-oriented ontology and what I have read about it online very briefly, isn't, well, it's quite secular, I would say, and not based on any sort of religious tenets or spiritual tenets at all. And then I wondered if you thought that object-oriented ontology could provide, when I think I heard you say during the presentation that you are quite critical of the idea of normativity. Well, I don't know if that's what you said, or I might have misheard. But I wondered if you thought that this approach to viewing, I suppose, the environment and things could cause us to, I suppose, it could cause us to take a more respectful or curious or well, I don't want to say, well, not necessarily in the sense of being paternalistic or but
I get that.
approaching approaching the environment in that way. So that's my first question. And then my second question has to do with, it's a sort of skepticism about when I think about, well, since you guys spoke about smart technologies, I was thinking about artificial intelligence, for instance, and how lots of, well, there are some people who who I suppose has to do with anthropomorphism, and maybe it's not just anthropomorphism, actually, maybe it's not anthropomorphism, maybe it's another sort of value that people ascribe to artificial intelligence, and which causes them or us to view AI as other, as a being or an artifact with its own interiority. But then I personally often feel quite critical of such approaches because they seem to, well, a common critique is that they mask the desires of the creators of these technologies, rather than there being actually any real what is it? Well, thing, desire, rationality belonging to the object itself. And I wondered what you thought about that as well.
Thanks, Deva. I mean, the second question I'm thinking about, the first question I'm actually quite excited to talk about because it's a question that is that I have thought about this. And my answer to that question about what I think about object ontology and environment is, this is why I'm more like, I thought of myself as Telos. Obviously, I said that a lot of my work comes from Andres Philippolis' work on the city and on spatial justice and thinking about law in the city and about immersion, about lawscape, about the idea that the environmental lawscape is always, you're always in the middle of it, and that there is no the idea that the environment is out there, that it is a background condition, is something that I have sought to dispute throughout my work. And I principally think of it not as that it doesn't exist, but that environment is something that is not just a background condition. It's not just out there, but something that we always find ourselves immersed in. And this is this immersion is the middle that Deleuze talks about in his work. And I think for me, environment was always about, object was always about always being surrounded by it, right? Like we're always within the realm of the object. In fact, today in the morning when I was reading for some of it today, Heidegger's entire, like, okay, let's not get into that. But what I wanted to say was that for me, that was very clear, that environment is not out there for conservation or protection or for inspiration, poetry. Everything could be there, like that's all right. It's all legitimate and legible. But for me, the way I understood environment, especially urban environment, was one that I was immersed in and that was channelized through the presence of the body, like through my felt body. But what is it that I was? So that was a huge part of my work on environment and O. And how triple O, I think Timothy Morton's, there's a book of his called Ecology Without Nature. Is that right? Ecology Without Thought, or Ecology Without Nature. That was a very powerful book for me to think through the value, to the question of what constitutes environment, rather than saying that I know what the urban environment is. So if I dispute that, like if I contest that argument that I know what an urban environment is, that I know what an object is, and I wanted to start with, okay, let's not get there. Let's just, and so I did a lot of walking in the city and with a lot of groups and talked about safety and talked about streetlights and how I encountered them. So that's how I thought of objects and environment, um, and triple O and environment. As far as the question of the AI is concerned, one, I'll let Tom talk about it. But secondly, I do not think that I am comfortable. You're right. You're absolutely right with the anxiety of posing that kind of agentic capacity for inert object. But Stephen Shaviro's work actually has this brilliant description of panpsychism, which my question in my work was, does a streetlight have a law, right? And I explored that question by saying that whether or not a streetlight can think for itself, the phrase is that we can assume that it does, like it thinks. Like, what is it to be a streetlight is not my question. That would be anthropomorphism, right? Like, what does it mean to think like a certain object is an anthropomorphic thing. But instead, the Shaviro's thing is that it is very much possible to exclaim that a certain thing thinks. Like, it's okay. We don't have to. But that in itself constitutes an interiority, and that's how he brings in panpsychism, and we can get into it a lot more than what I'm willing to. But it's just this idea that there is, and it is possible that there is an interiority to things, that there is, but we don't need to rush to give it the language of subjecthood, the subjectivity, or to think about agency and to think about But we can acknowledge that and we can think of it. So there is, I would totally, I can flirt with panpsychism in the work that I'm proposing, because I think that there is some value. But having said that, would I extend it to artificial intelligence? The thing that worries me about AI, or the thing that I don't know enough about AI, that's my thing. I don't know enough about AI processes or the interface or the political language of it. But what really I'm curious about to learn is whether or not what is the vital effect in an AI? Like where does it become vital, right? Like so what makes it vital? What are the processes that makes it vital? Why is it that are we only concerned about the interface? That's the confusion for me. Like, is it the code or the interface that is vital? And if it is, then code is an object. So, yeah, I don't think I'm the best person to talk about AI at the moment. Maybe when I present my work, that is better than that. Is that okay, Seva? Thank you. That was a good question.
Yes, thank you.
I was thinking something about this second question, which is, I mean, what I usually think about this, because you know this critical approach to AI is really common, where people say, you know, I'm very critical of AI because I know that it is just an instrument and it is actually determined by these guys who own the company, who are rich white men, and so the AI is just actually rich white men disguising as an AI. And I think that is really weak as a critical approach, because it is very critical in the sense of, you know, sort of unveiling these guys who are, you know, obviously horrible people doing horrible things most of the time. But it, from the point of view of technology, which is the specificity of the question and even of intelligence, it's really the less critical, the most traditional, the most modern colonial point of view that you could have about technology, which is that it is a neutral instrument, a neutral means to human posited ends. That's a concept of technology that is so non-critical that it is what technology is considered to be in modernity for the long time in which you don't have philosophy of technology or media theory. Just as soon as you have philosophy of technology or media theory, it is when you start seeing that technology is not what, you know, the classic modern conception of technology says it is, which it is just a neutral means to human ends. And that is the case for any technology. I mean, it's a very bad critical move to say this is just an instrument, because you're just misplacing the problem. You know, of course, those people are evil. Of course, they are trying their best to use this as an instrument to their own oppressive and expropriative ends. And of course, they are being able to do that in many ways. But the specificity of the problem of technology and of the problem of artificial intelligence is precisely something that is separate from that and beyond that. And then specifically when you're talking about intelligence, the way I tend to see it is that we are stuck with the problem of, you know, is this something that we're going to create and that is going to do no less, no more than what we program it to create, which is this sort of naive instrumental view of technology that I was just referring to, or we see it as a completely alien thing. So just as soon as we create artificial general intelligence, then it's going to accelerate exponentially. We're going to have a singularity and it's going to swallow us and destroy us and rip us apart or something like that. And I think neither of those two things is true. The first, for the reasons that I've already mentioned, And the second, because I don't think it is a correct conception of this process of the externalization of intelligence to think that it's something that is going to happen, that this technological singularity, this moment in which the pull of external intelligence starts to become an alien force that pulls us as, you know, Homo sapiens, as human animals, as material bodies, along with it, that it's something that it's going to happen in the future at some point, you know, when the guy, like in Terminator 1, makes the thing and it escapes the little box. And so you have to, the whole problem becomes, you know, how you're going to keep it in a box, or how you're going to establish a sort of little set of rules that is never going to be able to break, which I think are all very naive points of view. I think the process in which intelligence becomes something alien to us, that is pulling humanity from the future, as it were, begins with anthropogenesis itself. You know, it begins just as soon as we liberate the hands and start interacting with matter. And I don't even think that's a specifically human thing. It's a specifically human way of having becoming, which is something that all other beings also have. But the specificity of human becoming has to do with this process. So I think it's something that is already happening. You know, all when we think, you know, when is it that intelligence is going to start happening outside of our heads and start becoming an uncontrollable process? I mean, just look at it. It's already happening. Like, no one is controlling what is happening. No one is controlling capitalism. No human is rationally deciding whether we should keep extracting and burning oil, or you know, producing more. Like, that is just being decided by mechanisms that are completely externalized and collectivized. So I think it's mostly probably a misplaced problem. That's the way I see it, at least.
This is why I let you talk about this than I did. I there's so much to talk about in terms of technology, which is the other thing that where object-oriented ontology and philosophy has made a lot of appearance. In fact, object-oriented emerges in the earlier vision from computer sciences, computer program, although they say that it doesn't, but the very language of object-oriented. Anyways, that's nothing to do with technology. I think I have to leave now.
I think it's
So,
about time we should be wrapping it up. I mean, we did start a little bit late, but I think now is a good time.
yeah. Thank you
Yeah, thanks
for
everyone
your
for coming.
invitation.
Yeah,
It was
and
a lot of fun.
yeah, thanks. Thanks everyone. See you probably soon. We don't know yet what our next meeting is going to be, but we're going to try to set it up soon. This is going to be on YouTube soon, and consider submitting papers to our critical legal conference. Thanks, Swastee, again for everything, and see you all soon.